So skills-based hiring. I have to admit, when I started to think about this concept, I thought about it as a really potentially a very big threat to higher education and to what colleges do. And as a higher education reporter, that really got my attention. Hi, I'm Goldie Blumenstick. I started to delve into this topic a little bit for the Chronicle in the past year as I've been working on issues related to career-ready education. One of the reasons it got my attention is the fact that it's out there. We've done some digging around with some studies on this topic, and we've learned that 23% of HR directors now say that they value an education credential less than they valued other job qualifications. Just over the past 5 years, that's changed. 62% of employers have adopted some form of skills-based hiring in a way that de-emphasizes degree in some ways. They've not given up on the degree, but they're de-emphasizing it. And 39% of people in HR now believe that some pre-hire assessments will pose a significant challenge to the value of college degrees within 3 years. That's a short time frame for a change like this in what's happening in the world. So I'm really delighted today to have the opportunity to discuss these issues with my fellow panelists, Joann, Kieran, and Alex. And Alex, I'm going to start off right with you you've got the perspective from the Society of Human Resource Management. Why is this trend happening? What's happening in the work market right now?
I think the big driver, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Goldie, for the question and the invite. But when I think of this, I think the real driver that we're seeing when it really relates to competency-based hiring, skills-based hiring, is the time to fill, right? If you ask what's really motivating an individual HR director to get to the point where they are looking at alternative options, it's how do I mitigate the talent shortages that my organization has, and what do I do specifically to help me identify or predict better than what I have been in the past. Too often what we've seen is that organizations are really focused primarily on biodata that is indicative of or predictive of some form of performance, and rather not looking at a skills-based approach. And so I see a real movement as we're headed this way. The other thing that is a real leading indicator in my mind as I think about this is what small to mid-sized enterprises are saying, or what small to mid-sized organizations are saying, because you gave the global statistic around 62 or 63%, but the laggards tend to be the small to mid-sized businesses in some cases, and we're seeing that over the course of the past 5 years, just from our data, it's jumped from just under 10% to nearly double that. Almost 22% of small businesses are actually taking advantage of some form of skills-based hiring practice.
And these are the companies that don't have like these vast resources in front of them, yet they're still doing it.
Exactly.
I think it might reflect some questions about the value of the degree, and I hope we can talk about that a little bit more along the way as well. Joann, how does this change the role of the college in the course of the context? You represent Western Governors University, which is not a very traditional kind of college, but nonetheless, sure, you're still in that world of higher ed. How does it, what does it do to the whole paradigm of higher ed?
Well, at Western Governors, we're really interested in the question of how we can help students achieve. We've always said achieve their dreams of a degree and workplace success. And I think that begs the question of if the dream is no longer of a degree, then what are we helping them achieve? There's a couple things that it changes for us. One is that we need to start to understand what we're offering students in terms of what they need in order to get hired. And so we have started to really emphasize the building of our curriculum based on skills and understanding the skills that we are assessing. We are primarily an assessor of competency because we are a competency-based institution, but it also—
You're not an educator. I mean, you don't teach.
We do teach, but we teach when there's a gap. So we don't assume the gap. We allow the students and we mentor the students to help determine when they are ready to be assessed for competency. And if we determine that there is a gap and they're not ready to be assessed, then that's when we teach.
Most colleges don't work that way. What does this mean for the rest of higher ed? I mean, most colleges see their mission as teaching.
They see their mission as teaching, and I think in most cases it is. Of course, it's also research and some other things as well, service. But I think what is really different about the way we've approached it is that a typical institution, a class or a course, is approached as a guild. You have a professor or you have a group of professors who manage the entire course experience from start to finish. We approach the student experience as a team of specialists who specialize in everything from the beginning to the end of that experience, with the end being the assessment, the beginning being the placement, and then the mentoring and learning that takes place in the middle, handled by people who specialize in each of those areas.
Kieran, at General Assembly, you are very focused on skills. Obviously, that you don't stay in business if you don't provide those kind of skills. What's the connection? How do you make these connections with employers? And how do you know what they want?
I think in a straightforward way we ask. So there's two main things we do. One is we have standards boards that actually inform our curriculum across each of our topic areas, which are web development, data science, product management, user experience design, and business. And then the other thing we do is all of our teachers are more on the practitioner side rather than the research side. So that infuses a certain, right at the source of where the information is coming from, a sense of, and I think it sort of harks back to what Steve from Goodwill said, but I think adults really, when they're learning, they want to understand the goal, they want to understand the application of it, and what they can do with it in terms of creating. And so it's complex coordination, but the concept itself is very straightforward.
So as I think about this, so I've now learned the new phrase, don't call it a boot camp anymore, call it a tech skills boot camp, right? Not a coding boot camp.
Works for me.
Right, good enough. But it's, your curriculum's it's relatively narrow compared to what a major research university does. What you do, is it in any way even applicable to what a college would want to do if a college or some other kind of educational organization wanted to focus more on teaching skills and connecting with employers on skills? I mean, you've got a narrow base. They've got a broader brief.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think from our perspective as a young company, we've focused on the areas where there's the most labour market demand, and therefore there's the best chance for us to have a sustainable business around those areas. But if you think about, I think what we all talk about, it's that skills are changing, the demands of the labour force are changing, and so there is so much room in the market for providers to actually be adapting their curriculum, and I don't think there's any university out there that isn't sunsetting programs and introducing new ones in response to either employer demand or popular demand from their student base.
So this system, and where we're talking about an approach where the hiring isn't just done based on some notion of a degree out there, but something a little bit more specific, some specific kind of skill. It does rely on better signals, relies on better assessments. Yeah. Are we there yet?
I believe that the puzzle pieces are there, but we haven't put them together yet. We know that the technology can help us to better understand skills, to better understand what is a trusted assessment of somebody's competence or skills, and what is more on the lines of self-report or other report. I believe that we are at a point where we can start to understand our curriculum and understand it in smaller packaging.
We being WGU, or we being the world at large here?
We being the world of education and work. And I believe that we are seeing an increased interest and commitment to figuring out how the different ways we talk about these things can come together. And I don't necessarily believe that we all need to agree that there's only one way to talk about skills, but I do think we need to figure out how to tag to each other's ways so that we can understand them.
I'd argue, just as Joanna is saying, really, the core missing piece is that missing piece around the lexicon. Mm-hmm. And it's not lexicon as in we say it all the same way, we measure it all the same way. It's really, what do we do to identify or tag those different pieces and assess them in a variety of different ways,
but
right?
Do we really have to test yet? I mean, you're an expert in this area. I mean, we're talking about is testing people for skills. I mean, you can test if people can code, but Is that really what you want to use when you're hiring, or don't you hire for something
I would
more?
argue we do have. I mean, I'll give you a stat that really stands out in my mind. If you look at some recent work done by Credential Engine, there's 730,000 different credentials that tout themselves as competency-based or really focused in some way on skills-based hiring or skills-based proficiency. And what I would indicate is we probably have too many ways to assess. And that's what we're really running into, is not enough high-quality assessments, too many assessments that exist out there, and then on top of that, I'd also argue that we don't have the end user's perspective on that assessment, right? Much of it is trying to retrofit an assessment that exists out there to a different problem rather than trying to go ahead and identify what it is that the end user really needs out of a specific assessment. And I say that as a measurement professional, 20 years, where I assure you I have no friends, because going into measurement assures you have no friends, right? I design tests for a living.
What is it? What makes a good assessment?
At the end of the day,
without having to repeat your PhD twice. Yeah.
No. At the end of the day, the number one thing that makes an assessment valuable is whether or not you can predict or identify something for a valid use case. And that's the piece that we keep running into when we think about a measurement, is we try to think about what's valid from a legal perspective rather than thinking about what's valid from this particular use case and how I want to develop it, or how I want to assess someone's skills in a given scenario.
I might just add on that. So a passion of mine for the last 5 years at GA has been, I actually started our assessments team, and I completely agree with the concept that there's too many assessments out there, there's so many measures, and actually we spend a lot of time defining what skills matter with our employer set base, and then designing the assessment instruments. What we find difficult is not that part. The difficult part is actually the adoption on the employer side. And so how do you actually go from having 730,000 credentials to having the few that are relied upon at any scale? If you can't get that scale, then all the recruiters in the room are like, there's no way I'm paying attention to all those measures. I need to understand shorthand. I'm a busy person, what I can trust. And I think one of the things that started to help is actually involving those employers in the creation process of those assessments. That ensures that you at least have adoption from that subset, and then they can, I think, evangelize it with a lot more credibility than I can to their peers. But I think this conversation around competencies needs to evolve, I think, not just from defining and validating, but to what is the effort around adoption and coalescing around standards.
And really, what you're describing in my mind is a design thinking problem, right? It's let's build this with the design in mind and have all the perspectives in it. And to me, adoption, that's the first step in any kind of adoption. And that's why I couldn't agree more with Karen's perspective.
Yeah, it does seem like we still have this signal to noise problem out there in the market, similar to the problem that I hear sometimes about college degrees. No one knows what the college degree means, because there's 4,000 accredited colleges, and every degree means something different. 730,000 credentials seems like an exponentially more dangerous problem for us at this point.
I would say our approach to that design thinking problem, because you're right, is to try and deeply understand the pieces that we're bringing together, and make sure, because it is true. And I work with assessment professionals and consider them my friends. So I think there's hope for that. They're very lucky, is that what you said?
I said they're very lucky.
Of course, the predictability of the assessment is an important part, but from an equity perspective and being able to really truly move to skills-driven hiring and skills-driven training and learning, I think one thing that's important is that people need to understand how they're being assessed, and they need to be able to tell their own story as well. And that's one thing that we're working on understanding, because we realize that while there is a future that is machine readable, that will allow us to surface and I think help us bring signal through the noise, it's going to be some time before we don't need human-read understandings of those assessments, those accomplishments, and that ability to match my story with your skills gap.
So it's reminding me of this very depressing report that came out this week from the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce that talked about employment levels of people who have good jobs, and it seems like at whatever education level people are at, whites tend to get more good jobs than minority members, Hispanics and blacks. Is there any evidence, not just hope, that skills-based hiring will really put more equity into this system?
I would argue that it is a real lever that might help us with that particular issue. I would say, though, that the bigger lever is actually skills-based learning and skills-based education. In my mind, too much of the emphasis is put on assessments that cause some form of differential treatment or differential scoring, and I'd argue that the piece that it really is the lever that has the potential to make a huge difference is competency-based and skills-based kind of learning and development, right? And so I'll share with you that in my view, what we see as an assessment professional is that the assessments are tied too heavily to what an individual can read in many cases. And I would argue that skills-based assessment does need to evolve in that regard, but I'd also say that an individual's learning path is a much bigger predictor of what their capability is than actually the assessment itself.
And maybe just one quick thing to add to that, I think, Alex, the point there is that like the assessment's one point of the funnel to actually get into those roles, and you're really saying, let's look at the whole funnel, how system. I get to wherever that next destination is.
Without question.
And I think that is something we're really interested in, and it's one of the reasons we are laying our curriculum over this foundation of skills, because once we've done that, if we can understand what the employer is looking for, and if we can understand what the student is bringing to us, whether they're bringing it from General Assembly, from the work that they've done in other places, or education they've gotten somewhere else, and we can then start to, in a machine way, see those pathways, we can open a lot of doors and windows for people who don't necessarily know they're there.
I guess I'm still stuck on this, brother, for a second, because we've already these studies are showing that education levels don't really make a difference when we're talking about discrimination in hiring. There's still discrimination in hiring. Is there anything in the skills-based hiring system that would sort of overcome that?
I think so. Just to make sure I understand the question there, Goldie. It's like, how does this tool actually help with the goal around diversity and inclusion, right?
Yes,
and so from our experience, it absolutely has the potential. I think what we haven't yet seen is the real systemic change that actually it could unlock. And I think because in the hiring process, there are many, many factors, right? There is, I think for most hiring teams, a resource constraint. There's a shorthand of how they're used to doing things. And I think the ability, again, coming back to the adoption of these tools, particularly early in the process, in terms of even selecting the first pool of candidates get a first round interview, making sure that that comes from a much longer tail of resumes, and potentially using assessments to create a starting point. But then that comes back to Alex's point around making sure you seed the pool. So I think it's one critical part of the system, but I don't think, at least I haven't yet observed the results that would show that this is the answer.
So part of a holistic thing. What about, do the employers really know what skills they want, and how are they at communicating them?
So my experience with that is that on the recruiting side, it's secondhand. They're hearing it from actually the hiring manager or the hiring manager's boss. And so if you get that person and their peers in a room, they can actually very quickly get to the nuts and bolts of what they're looking for in a specific role. You have to then replicate that exercise across many roles in order to then have an impact on the hiring practices and the ability to explain to people what are the skills you're going to need. And importantly, if you do have the skills, what's your upside of acquiring them, and what sort of role will you get? And I think laying out that pathway, I think there's a lot of people doing good work in that area, but doing that in a way that's clear and crisp and can be synthesized is really important work.
I would agree with that. And I would say, in terms of are the employers sending good signals, I think when we have the time to sit down and talk about it, yes. But what we are finding is lacking in the labor market data and the labor, or maybe not lacking, but just lacking somewhere. And we have not been able to fully extract from labor market data, from job postings and those sorts of things, is the context. because the ability to apply a skill to a context, I think, is there's some alchemy there. And that's what we're not very good at describing yet, and we're not very good at assessing for necessarily, and we're not very good at communicating. That's, I think, the context piece. And leveling. How competent, you know, how, was it, Goodwill was talking about the five levels of experience. You know, I think there's a lot of double in those details.
I'd also go ahead and say that this is an area where, to some degree, it's almost an issue of translation. And I'm not to use a movie analogy, but it makes me think back to Office Space when they're trying to figure out what Tom Zibikowski does. Well, he translates what the customer wants to what the engineers need to build. And the first thing that stands out in my mind is immediately a hiring manager or a supervisor will say, this is what I need, these are the skills that I need. And the recruiter and the HR professional will go and try to build those things about, build a skill set that reflects that and build a job description for them that reflects that. What ends up happening, though, is immediately when you put those skills in place and you're thinking about leveling, what ends up happening is they're immediately looking at years of experience as the way to proxy for leveling. And it is done rampantly, and it ends up killing a lot of what we end up finding in terms of proficiency and true leveling. Good.
What else is missing? And I mean, we could talk. We need better assessments. We probably need clearer signals. We probably need some better definitions coming from each side. What else? I mean, let's say skills-based hiring is a desirable outcome in our market right now. Can you? What's missing in the system?
Well, I think if we're aiming to find untapped talent, one thing that we can do on the learning side is make sure that the learning opportunities that we are giving people is giving them evidence, because just saying I have this skill on a transcript is not the only evidence you're going to need. I mean, that might get you into the pool, but it's not going to get you through the interview. It's the portfolio that's going to get you through the interview. It's the story about, well, no, maybe I haven't done that for 20 years in a Fortune 500 or 100 company, but I have had the opportunity to apply this in this context in my learning experience, and I believe I could bring that to you in your context as an employer.
So do we need a tool to do that? I hear a lot of noise about click-through resumes, colleges are doing e-portfolios and things like that. But I also hear that people get hired like after a resume gets scanned for about 2 seconds or maybe by a machine. How do we sort of balance these two things?
There's a variety of different tools out there that I think are somewhat effective. I just wouldn't rely on them solely. In my mind, I think to Joann's point earlier, there's a piece that you just can't take out from a human perspective as far as those things are concerned. And when I think about that, what I think about is specifically if we were thinking about tools that are good at weeding out specific types of skills or identifying specific types of skills, I think that there are a variety out there that are really good at that. But I think the piece that's still missing is when we think about that end user, how is the end user going to disentangle that data and say, this is what I can do with it, or this is what I can present my hiring manager.
Whether that's an employer, whether that's a student, or whether it's someone putting together a training program.
Without question.
Yeah, if I could just add on that, I would say what's missing is actually, I think in this relationship between employers and potential employees, the power here is with the employers. And I think the first perspective of an employer is, we're special, we're looking for differentiated skills, we've got our own assessment, we're going to do our thing, and so if you're going to apply to me, the currency I'm looking for is you to demonstrate it in this way, and another company in the same space will do a slightly different way. They're not actually coalescing, or they're not incented to coalesce around a common standard, and so you've got the thing that you would have had in Europe a few decades ago. You cross the border, the currency you had doesn't work at the shop across the border to buy some chocolate because they don't recognize that. So if you're not actually coming to a common standard around the skills that matter, and multiple employers saying that is transferable in terms of the currency of how you measure that skill, then all of the tools will end up being anemically used, and you actually won't have, you won't be able to capture the potential of competency-based hiring.
I'm thinking about the role of the university in all this, because at some level, competency-based hiring does seem like in some way an indictment of just hiring based on a BA, right? We're going to use the BA as the screen, we're going to use the AA as the screen. But I do think that universities are now still in this mix and they're not going away. So what's the message for universities out of all this? They're not going to necessarily all teach to skills. They're going to still continue to do a little bit of what they're doing before. Are there some approaches that they should be doing to sort of help students tease out the expertise that they've been developing along the way?
I'd argue there's a step forward that's relatively easy. So in my mind, there's a gap in the market in terms of the university serving as that translator of skills. To some degree, I think that that's something that can still be offered both as a purveyor of assessments, skills-based assessments, as well as a purveyor of just those translation skills. And I think universities, whether they're the top tier 1 research programs or they're the tier 4 ones, I think there's an opportunity for them to really fill that gap that no one has really taken a stab at well to this point.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, there are a number of states. I know Texas is one of them because I was there when it was announced, that have asked colleges and universities to make transparent the skills that are inherent in their degrees, to sort of open up the box a little bit so that we can see in. That seems only fair. And I think the other thing, we talked a little bit about, okay, technical skills may be a little bit easier to define and understand and assess, but we know from reports in the literature and what we're seeing that there are a large number of skills which are variously defined: human skills and soft skills and employability skills and 21st century skills, and you can kind of put your label on it. We know that those are things that come with maturity, with experience, and with education. And it would behoove education, I think, to better understand how they develop those skills and enable their graduates to talk about it.
I think this challenge of helping students talk about it seems like an area where colleges are starting to pay attention, but not necessarily have developed all the right tools or nomenclature to go on. I think we're going to hop onto some questions coming from the app here. There's a question that says, can you talk about the move from hiring for experience to competency-based hiring for capability? Basically this thing we were highlighting before, where people just sort of think about experience but not skills.
I think just taking a stab at it here with some of the data that we've seen over the years, we run this research that looks specifically with hiring managers as well as HR directors, and it speaks to what challenges are the biggest skills challenges that they see every 5 years. And in our most recent one, HR 2020, what we found was that there was a jump in the number of employers who are trying non-traditional hiring practices. And what I mean by that is not just the competency-based hiring practice that we're talking about here today, but even some hiring practices like, we're just gonna bring you in if you're breathing and you have a pulse and you don't seem to be a mutant of some sort. But what we see is that they're providing jobs, and then at some point they're also providing competency-based skills learning after that pre-employment hire or that initial hire, and saying at the 6-month mark, we're going to determine whether or not you want to be part of this organization, whether or not we want you to be part of this organization. In my mind, that's a move that is much more akin to, something that is reminiscent of a talent shortage situation. And when I think of that, it makes me cringe a little bit as an industrial organizational psychologist, because I immediately think about bad hiring decisions and how those affect enterprises across the board as well as individuals. The other thing that stands out to me, though, is we're seeing this movement towards this competency-based kind of approach in the hiring, but that's really designed with more mitigated risk. And where I see it most effective is when employers are actually going straight to their educational institutions or those groups that would be the validator of skills and saying, this is what I need. This is exactly what I need. And I think that there are institutions that do that really well and say, okay, we're going to go ahead and provide you with a pool that comes from here. Whether or not you hire them is a separate issue, but this is where we'll go ahead and do that assessment component for you. WGU is one example of that. And I think that what we're seeing more of is that type of approach. Now, I'll share with you that the only thing that really is an issue with that in particular in my mind is smaller organizations, smaller enterprises just don't have the time to do that and don't have the resources to do that. And that's where it becomes a real issue in my mind.
We talk about skills-based hiring, really the advantages of it. The arguments for it are very much equity-based. I also wonder, though, whether when we're talking about going back to this notion of 730,000 credentials out there, and when we understand that not everybody is coming to this experience of looking for jobs and even developing the experience, they don't necessarily have they haven't been prepared for it properly. If we're thinking from the equity lens, does skills-based hiring put people from lower income backgrounds and from disadvantaged communities, does it put them at a disadvantage in this whole market? Because you have to know this game too. I mean, it's like the higher ed game, but a different game.
It's that storytelling piece again, no matter how it's told. And I think back to our very first panel, there are a tremendous number of skills that you obtain whether your business is sanctioned or not. And I think that one of the things we really do need to help people understand is where their talents and where their skills lie and what they can develop, so that they can see the space between where they are and...
Who does that, though?
And
I mean, I know in a college it's the Career Center office. If you're not in a college, and hopefully it's a Career Center office, increasingly it is, but what if you're not in a college?
I think at this point in time, there just isn't a good solution for that. And there's a tangible example from the real world that speaks to this, and it's really transitioning veterans. They're at a disadvantage when it comes to translating the skills that they have and the skills assessments that they've gone through to enter to really hit the civilian workforce. And we see it time and time again where it's actually creating a scenario. Now, there are smaller startups that really offer some form of kind of translation approach or really offer some sort of tools associated with helping do this, but I've seen it in one-off situations as opposed to really being truly successful. So there's another gap in the market if you were to look at it.
And it's a little shocking because nobody understands the skills they teach better than the military.
Right. And there is the military transcript that is
documented, but universities understand what they're teaching at the course level, and the military understands what they're teaching at the MOS level, and for some reason, they're too big and too small at the same time.
I mean, I know there's been some efforts to coordinate that military transcript more directly into college credit, and I guess Google's trying to do it for the job market because you can plug in your ratings from military, and Google will tell you what it is. But it does seem like if you're not in the military, if you're just a person trying to get ahead, there's not really, you need to count on a lot of social service agencies and a lot of other organizations to kind of help you tell your story.
Well, and that's why we're really interested in these pathways and understanding both the curriculum and the employment so that we can kind of, turn the lights on.
Okay, I see we have a question here about I'm not going to call it my favorite topic, but the topic that flummoxes me the most, blockchain. I never know what to do about blockchain. I can't decide if it's a big deal or not, but how far off do you see blockchain coming into the picture to validate skills and competencies? How important, is it just a thing?
I can take a crack at that.
Does this matter?
I think there's a risk with the topic like blockchain that it's so buzzy that it could actually confuse the problem we're trying to solve collectively, and I think that hey, maybe there is an issue where people are saying, I've got this credential, but they don't. But I think that like the issue of trust and whether or not someone actually has that currency to spend, I don't think is probably the core problem or the biggest problem that we need to solve right now. So based on that, I would hope that we're a while away from needing blockchain in the credentialing space.
And yet, I will add to that, Kieran. So I head up SHRM's competency-based credentialing program, and I would argue that about 5 out of every 8 calls that I get from a vendor is to sell me blockchain as a way to verify our credentials. And so I'd argue it's already here. Now, to me, the bigger issue is the matter of trust and whether or not we actually have true public trust in that regard. But it is something that is coming and cannot fight at this point.
But I guess my point is there's a lot of different ways to validate whether someone has a credential. Blockchain's one mechanism, and maybe for some credentials more than others, but I'm not sure that that is like the #1 most burning issue, and then blockchain is one of many ways to solve it.
No, I'd agree with you. In fact, when I look at some of the data that we have just from HR professionals and recruiters in particular, many of them are not as interested in blockchain, and they almost fear it to some degree.
Well, that might be a harsh lesson for some of the people in the room who are developing blockchain technology right now. But I think, but it's an important one to surface, because if that becomes a red herring in this discussion, if it's not the question of no one doubts you that you really took the class, but whether you actually learned the material, that's really the difference, right?
Yeah, I would agree.
All right, I think we have time for one quick question. Is job profiling a good tool for skills-based hiring? Oh, this is a long question. To identify needed competencies for a given job, to develop, oh man, I'm not following this question.
It's the circle, right?
Okay.
It's
job profiling, and then,
from the job to the training to the learner to the job to the training to the learner.
right.
It's always a good idea to explain what you're looking for when you put out a job.
Right.
I'll never forget my advisor in grad school said to me, there's no truer edict when it comes to any kind of problem involving data or information. Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, from everything I've heard along the way, the description of the job is the place to start, and if it's not specific enough, most of them are not. And then that's really where, that could probably save a lot more time in this process as well. Yeah. Oh, great. You guys, Joann, Kieran, Alex, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.